Halfway through my beach trip, my daughter-in-law called and told me I needed to leave my own condo. Not because of an emergency, not because something was broken, but because her parents needed the space. She didn't ask, she informed. And I said something that surprised even me. All right. If this story meant something to you, if you believe dignity should never be negotiated, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before I tell you what I did less than an hour later, the quiet move that changed everything, let me take you back to that balcony. Because nothing about that morning suggested a storm was coming. The ocean was still. The kind of still that only exists before tourists fully wake up. I was sitting on the balcony of my beach condo, bare feet tucked under me, watching the tide slide in and out like it had all the time in the world. I had earned that view, not inherited it, not married into it, earned it. 37 years in corporate accounting, 12 years widowed, a lifetime of saying no to luxuries so I could say yes to security. When my husband passed, I didn't collapse. I reorganized. That's what financial controllers do. We assess, we reallocate, we stabilize. The condo was my stabilization. My promise to myself that the second half of my life would not be defined by survival. It would be defined by ownership. So when my phone lit up with Vanessa's name, my daughter-in-law, I expected something superficial. A restaurant recommendation, a question about the weather. Instead, I heard this. "Alina, I need to talk to you about the condo." Her tone wasn't rude, that would have been easier. It was smooth, polished, pre-decided. "My parents arrived earlier than expected," she continued. "They're excited to spend real time at the beach, and honestly, it would be more comfortable if you stayed somewhere else for a few days. Maybe a hotel nearby?" The waves kept moving. My breathing did not change. "I see," I said. "We just need privacy. They're used to a certain level of space and it's hard to relax when, well, you're there. When I'm there. In my own property." She didn't say it harshly. Vanessa never does, that's her strength. She packages displacement as practicality. I glanced around the balcony. The teak table I bought secondhand and refinished myself. The blue ceramic planters I carried up 3 flights of stairs because I didn't want delivery fees. The sliding door I replaced after a hurricane season insurance dispute. I paid for every hinge, every tile, every inch. "Matthew agrees," she added gently. That part stung, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. My son hates tension, he always has. As a child, if 2 classmates argued, he would volunteer to apologize just to restore peace, even if he hadn't done anything wrong. He grew into a man who believes harmony is the highest virtue. Vanessa understands that very well. "It's only 5 or 6 days," she said. "You're flexible." Flexible, that word lingered. Flexible is what people call you when they expect you to bend. "I'll pack a few things," I said. A pause. She hadn't prepared for agreement. "Oh," she replied. "Well, good, that makes this easy." Easy, yes, that's what it looked like. We ended the call without tension, without raised voices, without drama, and that's exactly why she believed she had won. But here's something I've learned in 67 years: the quietest response is not always surrender. Sometimes it's alignment. I stood there for several minutes after hanging up, not crying, not angry, just thinking, because this wasn't the first time Vanessa had tested the perimeter. There had been smaller moments. Little comments about how wasted the condo was sitting unused most of the year. Observations about future planning. Casual statements like, "Well, eventually it'll all be Matthew's anyway." Eventually. It's an interesting word. It implies inevitability, but inevitability requires consent, and I had given none. I went inside slowly, opened the bedroom closet, pulled out my suitcase. And as I folded clothes, I realized something important. She wasn't just asking for a few days. She was rehearsing occupancy, rehearsing entitlement, rehearsing a version of the future where my presence was optional. And rehearsals matter. They prepare people psychologically. If you allow someone to practice replacing you, eventually they stop seeing you at all. I zipped my suitcase, checked the kitchen, turned off the stove. I moved with the same precision I used during quarterly audits. No wasted motion, no visible emotion. Then I sat down at the small desk near the hallway, opened my laptop, and made a phone call, not to argue. Not to complain, not to my son, to Samuel. Samuel Price has been my attorney for 14 years. Measured man, rarely surprised. "Alina," he answered. How's the ocean? Calm, I said. That may change. A brief pause. I assume this isn't about tides? No, it's about occupancy. I told him everything. Every word Vanessa used, every subtle phrasing, every implication. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question. Do you want this handled quietly or decisively? I looked around my condo one more time. At the framed photograph of Matthew as a boy holding a plastic shovel in this very sand. At the floorboards I installed after watching 3 online tutorials. At the ledger in my drawer tracking every improvement cost. Both, I said. Samuel chuckled softly. I'll prepare the documents. That was the quiet move. And Vanessa had no idea it was already in motion. I called a cab. By the time Gordon and Lucille Hayes arrived, crisp linen clothes, oversized sunglasses, evaluating the building facade like inspectors, I was already in the lobby. Vanessa stepped out of the SUV with confident ease. "Alina," she said brightly, "that was fast." "I'm efficient," I replied. Gordon shook my hand like he was closing a business deal. Lucille scanned my suitcase. "I hope you found something comfortable," she said. "Beach motels can be charming." Charming, I smiled politely. Matthew stood slightly behind them, eyes down, avoiding collision. "Just a few days, Mom," he said softly. "Yes," I answered, "just a few days." I stepped into the cab, and as we pulled away, I saw them enter the building as though it already belonged to them. Vanessa's hand rested casually on the lobby rail. Ownership is often practiced long before it is granted. The motel I chose was not unpleasant. Simple, clean, temporary, which is exactly what I intended it to be. I placed my suitcase on the bed, sat down, and waited. Because when someone believes they've displaced you, they relax. They reveal more. In less than an hour after I left, my phone rang, not from Vanessa, from someone else. And what they told me confirmed everything I suspected. But I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring once more. Because sometimes, timing is the difference between reacting and restructuring. And what I did next would ensure that no one would ever again suggest I stay somewhere else in my own home. Occupancy. The phone rang a second time before I answered it. I already knew it wasn't Vanessa. Vanessa doesn't call twice when she believes she's in control. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the voice asked when I finally picked up. "Yes, this is Daniel from Coastal Property Services. I'm calling to confirm the interior consultations scheduled for this afternoon at your unit." I didn't speak for a moment. Consultation. "Who scheduled that?" I asked calmly. "A Mrs. Vanessa Whitmore. She mentioned exploring layout optimization and potential structural revisions." Structural revisions. I thanked him politely and ended the call. Then I sat very still on the edge of that motel bed. Because now it wasn't about a few days of privacy. It wasn't about comfort for visiting parents. It was about rehearsal, just as I suspected. You don't schedule structural consultations in someone else's property unless you believe authority is already shifting. I dialed Samuel immediately. "They've scheduled contractors," I said. "Interior consultation." He was quiet for a beat. "Good," he replied. "That confirms intent." "How so?" Occupancy strategy often begins with visible planning. It creates psychological positioning. Were they aware of the trust amendment? No, even better, the trust amendment. That was the document Samuel prepared 6 months ago after I noticed something subtle in Matthew's financial patterns. Not wrongdoing, just pressure. Vanessa had been suggesting joint ventures, encouraging asset consolidation, reframing inheritance as future planning. I'm not suspicious by nature, but I am trained to recognize patterns. So I quietly placed the condo into an irrevocable trust with specific clauses, residency restrictions, access limitations, automatic disqualification triggers for fraudulent representation. No drama, just structure. Vanessa believed eventual inheritance meant inevitable ownership. She never asked what conditions were attached. That afternoon, while Gordon and Lucille were likely sipping wine on my balcony discussing open concepts, I called the building's property manager. "This is Alina Whitmore," I said. "Unit 3 billion, I need to update access authorization." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore." "Effective immediately, only I and my attorney Samuel Price have decision-making authority regarding structural consultations, vendor access, or modifications. Anyone else requesting entry for those purposes should be denied." "Understood." Also, I added, if any contractor arrives today, please inform them the owner has not authorized evaluation. There was a small pause. Mrs. Whitmore, there is a contractor currently signing in. I checked the time. 2:14 p.m. Please relay the message. Silence on the line while he walked across the lobby, then muffled voices. A shift in tone. A faint protest I recognized even without hearing the words. Vanessa, a few minutes later he returned. The contractor has left. The younger woman is requesting to speak with you. Of course she was. My phone buzzed seconds later. Vanessa. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. A leaner, she said, still polished but thinner around the edges. There seems to be a misunderstanding with the front desk. Is there? They're refusing to allow the designer upstairs. That's correct. A beat of silence. Why? Because I didn't authorize one. Well, I assumed. Yes, I said gently. You did. The quiet between us stretched longer this time. We were only exploring ideas, she continued smoothly. Dad has experience in development. It would be irresponsible not to consider upgrades. Irresponsible to whom? I asked. To the family, this property is underutilized. Underutilized. The language of acquisition always sounds practical. Vanessa, I said calmly, you asked me to leave for privacy, not renovation. Plans evolve. Ownership does not. Her breathing shifted slightly, not anger, calculation. Matthew was excited about modernizing it, she said carefully. Was he? I asked. Or was he avoiding disagreement? That landed. She didn't answer immediately. You're overreacting, she said finally. It's just paint samples. You scheduled structural evaluation. You're being territorial. I smiled at that, territorial, as if defensive property is emotional rather than legal. I am being precise, I corrected. There's a difference. Gordon's voice sounded faintly in the background, authoritative, asking what was happening. Vanessa covered the receiver briefly. I could hear the edge in her whisper. When she returned, her tone had shifted again, lighter, conciliatory. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. We're family. Family doesn't require displacement, I replied. Family requires respect. You said all right, she reminded me. Yes, I said softly. I did, and that is when she realized the meaning of that word had not been what she assumed. That evening I opened social media, not out of pettiness, out of observation. Vanessa had posted already, a sunset photo from my balcony. Caption, evaluating long-term potential, excited for what's next. What's next? Gordon commented, impressive asset. Lucille added a champagne emoji. Matthew had liked the photo. That part hurt more than the caption. Not because he agreed, but because he didn't pause. I closed the app and folded my hands. This is how entitlement grows, small permissions, unchallenged language, repetition of assumption until it feels real. At 8:47 p.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Matthew. Hi, Mom. His voice carried strain. Hello, sweetheart. Vanessa said you blocked the designer. Yes, she's upset. I imagine she is. Silence. Mom, couldn't we just look at options? It doesn't mean anything. It means positioning, I said gently. For what? For a future I haven't agreed to, he exhaled. It's just hard being in the middle. Then step out of the middle, I said quietly. Stand somewhere. That silence was heavier. I don't want conflict, he admitted. Avoiding conflict doesn't prevent it, I replied. It postpones it. He didn't argue because deep down he knows that's true. We'll talk when I get back, he said. Yes, I answered. We will. After we hung up, I looked at the ocean from the motel window. Smaller view, narrower horizon. But still the same tide. And I thought about something women are rarely taught. Boundaries are not hostility. Boundaries are clarity. When you surrender small spaces to keep peace, you slowly teach people you are movable. Immovable things are eventually relocated. I called Samuel once more. They're escalating through optics, I told him. Good, he said calmly. That accelerates timeline. Timeline? Tomorrow morning, he said, we formalize notification. And then we see how badly she wants to test structural clauses. I slept lightly that night. Not anxious, alert. At 6:12 a.m., my phone vibrated on the nightstand, a text from the property manager. Mrs. Whitmore, your daughter-in-law attempted to access your storage locker this morning. We denied entry. Storage locker. That was new. I responded with a simple, Thank you, continue to restrict access. Less than 3 minutes later, Vanessa called again. This time her voice had lost its polish entirely. Why are you blocking everything? She demanded quietly. Because it is mine, I replied. You're humiliating us in front of my parents. I did not invite your parents. You're making it seem like we're intruders. Are you? The silence that followed was the first honest one between us. She recovered quickly. This isn't over, she said softly. No, I agreed. It isn't. And as I ended the call, I finally opened the email Samuel had sent at midnight. Attached was the formal notice. Not eviction, not accusation. Clarification: legal reinforcement of ownership, access limitation, and misuse penalties under trust protection. Structured, unemotional, precise. I stared at the document for a long moment before signing electronically. Because once sent, there would be no pretending this was a misunderstanding. It would expose intention. And intention, once exposed, changes relationships permanently. I clicked send, and less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't Vanessa, it wasn't Matthew, it wasn't the property manager, it was Lucille Hayes. And her voice was very different from the one she used on balconies. The call from Lucille Hayes did not sound like a woman calling for pleasantries. Eleanor, she began, her voice controlled but strained, I believe we need to clarify something immediately. I sat upright in the motel chair, folding my hands in my lap. I agree. There was a pause on her end. I could hear the ocean faintly through her receiver, my ocean from my balcony. We've just received a rather formal legal notice, she continued. It suggests that Vanessa and Matthew have no authority to authorize renovations, occupancy extensions, or vendor consultations. That is correct, I said evenly. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Vanessa indicated, Lucille continued carefully, that there was a family understanding regarding eventual transfer. I did not rush to answer. Words, when timed correctly, carry more weight. There was no such understanding, I replied. At any time, I could almost hear her recalibrating. She seemed very confident. Confidence, I said gently, does not constitute consent. Silence, then a quieter tone. Gordon is concerned, she admitted, concerned. Not embarrassed, not apologetic, concerned, which told me something important. This wasn't about my feelings, it was about optics. Concerned about what? I asked. About how this appears, she said plainly. We were under the impression this property was already being prepared as part of Matthew and Vanessa's long-term asset plan. Asset plan. There it was again. The language of assumption disguised as inevitability. Lucille, I said calmly, did Vanessa tell you that I had signed anything? She said it was implied. Implied by whom? That landed harder than I expected. Her composure wavered just slightly. Eleanor, surely you understand how inheritance works. I understand how wills work, I replied, and trusts. She didn't speak immediately, and in that silence something shifted. Is the condo in a trust? She asked carefully. Yes, I did not elaborate, I did not need to, the air changed completely. I see, she said slowly. No champagne emojis now, no subtle critiques, just realization. Gordon's voice sounded in the background, lower, more agitated than before. Lucille covered the phone briefly. When she returned, her tone had lost its edge entirely. Vanessa was under the impression that modernization discussions were welcomed. Modernization, I repeated softly, requires ownership. She may have misinterpreted enthusiasm. There was none. The quiet between us was no longer polite. It was evaluative. Eleanor, Lucille said finally, I want to be clear, we would never knowingly overstep. I believed her, which made the situation more telling. Then you were misinformed, I said simply, a breath on her end. Vanessa mentioned that you were open to stepping back from managing the property. I almost smiled. Stepping back, that is how displacement is reframed. Lucille, I said calmly, if I choose to step back, it will not be because someone rehearsed stepping forward. That one held. She understood it. This is awkward, she admitted. It doesn't have to be, I replied. It simply needs to be accurate. After we ended the call, I remained still for several minutes because something had just cracked, not loudly. Not dramatically, but audibly enough for those listening closely. Vanessa had told her parents more than she told me. She had constructed a narrative, one where I was gently fading. One where eventual ownership was not a question but a timeline. That is not ambition, that is preemptive inheritance. My phone buzzed again, this time from Matthew. Mom, he said immediately, Vanessa's upset. Her parents are asking questions. Good, I replied quietly. He sighed. Did you have to involve lawyers? Did she have to involve contractors? Silence. She thought you wouldn't mind, he said weakly. She didn't ask, she assumed. Exactly. He was quiet for a long time. Mom, is the condo in a trust? Yes. Since when? 6 months. That stunned him. Why didn't you tell me? Because nothing had been triggered, I said gently. Until now, he swallowed. I could hear it. Vanessa said you were planning to transfer partial control after retirement. Vanessa says many things. Another silence, this one heavier. Mom, did she misunderstand? No, I said softly. She constructed? That word settled between us. Matthew is intelligent. He just prefers peace over precision. But precision has a way of surfacing when peace is threatened. Her parents look blindsided, he admitted. Then perhaps you should ask why? He didn't answer because I had just introduced doubt, not accusation, doubt. And doubt is far more destabilizing to manipulation than anger. That afternoon, Vanessa texted me directly. I think you're escalating unnecessarily. We're family. I responded. Family does not operate on assumptions. Her reply came quickly. You're embarrassing us. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Embarrassment requires exposure. She didn't respond after that. Around 4 p.m., Samuel called. I assume Lucille has reached out, he said calmly. She has. Tone revised. He chuckled softly. Good, what happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we watch. For what? For reaction. Entitlement resists correction before it retreats. I thought about that carefully. And if it escalates, then we reinforce structure. That evening, the property manager sent another update. Vanessa had attempted to schedule a cleaning service in preparation for long-term use. Denied. The pattern was becoming clearer. She wasn't reacting emotionally, she was accelerating positioning. That night I drove back toward the building quietly, not to enter, not yet, just to observe from across the street. The balcony lights were on. I could see silhouettes moving. Gordon gesturing broadly, Vanessa pacing, Lucille seated, Matthew standing near the railing alone. I did not go inside, I didn't need to, because this was no longer about physical space. It was about narrative control. And narrative was slipping from her grasp. The next morning, Samuel forwarded me something unexpected. You should see this, he said. Attached was a forwarded email from a junior associate at a regional bank. Vanessa had inquired about asset-backed lending against the condo address. My condo, without ownership, without authorization. My breathing did not change, but my clarity sharpened. She wasn't just rehearsing residency. She was exploring leverage. I called Samuel immediately. Is this actionable? Not yet, he replied. Inquiry alone isn't fraud, but paired with attempted occupancy positioning, it indicates strategy. So she's thinking beyond a few days. She's thinking structurally. That word again. Structurally, which meant she believed time and optics could override documentation. That afternoon, Vanessa called me once more. This time her voice was soft, almost fragile. Alina, I think this is getting out of proportion. Is it? My parents are upset. Matthew is distant. This isn't what I wanted. What did you want? I asked quietly, a long pause. Security, interesting answer. Security built on whose asset? I asked. Silence, then carefully. Eventually it would have been ours anyway. There it was again. Eventually, I let that word linger in the space between us. Vanessa, I said gently, eventually is not entitlement, it is contingency. You don't trust me, she said softly. Trust follows behavior, I replied. That landed harder than anything else I had said so far. Because it was simple, clean, undeniable, she exhaled slowly. We need to talk in person. We will, I said. Soon? I ended the call and looked out at the ocean once more. The tide was shifting again, quietly, relentlessly. And I realized something important. Vanessa believed modernization equaled authority. She believed proximity equaled possession. She believed that if she acted like an owner long enough, others would adapt. But she underestimated something fundamental. I built that condo line by line, payment by payment, year by year, and women who build from scratch understand something that those who inherit rarely do. Ownership is not emotional. It is documented, and documentation was about to become very inconvenient for her. Because what Vanessa didn't know yet was that the trust contained a clause she had just triggered, and once triggered, it could not be undone. The clause she triggered there is a particular kind of silence that follows overconfidence. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it is the silence of someone realizing they miscalculated the room. When Samuel told me Vanessa had triggered a clause in the trust, I did not feel triumph. I felt confirmation. "Explain it to me carefully," I said to him over the phone that morning. Samuel never rushes. "The condo is held in an irrevocable trust," he began. "You are the sole lifetime beneficiary. Upon your passing, distribution is conditional." "Conditional upon what?" I asked, though I already remembered drafting it. "Conditional upon no documented attempt by any beneficiary or associated party to assert premature control, misrepresent ownership, pursue asset-backed leverage, or establish unauthorized residency." I closed my eyes briefly. And Vanessa's bank inquiry combined with attempted vendor authorization and storage access qualifies as material assertion. Meaning, he said evenly, if this proceeds to formal review, Matthew's inheritance pathway can be suspended. The room felt smaller for a moment. Not because I was afraid, because I understood the weight of that. "Suspended permanently?" I asked. "It depends on your discretion," Samuel replied. "You retain amendment authority regarding distribution outcomes." I exhaled slowly. This was never about punishing my son, it was about protecting the structure I built. "Does Matthew know?" I asked. "Not yet, but he will need to." That afternoon, I drove back to the condo building again. This time not to observe from across the street, this time to enter. The lobby felt different when I stepped inside. The property manager nodded at me with quiet understanding. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for enforcing access," I said. "Of course." I took the elevator up alone. When the doors opened, I could hear voices inside the unit. Vanessa's voice was controlled but sharper than usual. Gordon's was firm. Lucille's lower, more concerned. Matthew's quiet. I unlocked the door with my key. The room stilled immediately. Vanessa stood near the kitchen island. Gordon turned. Lucille looked up slowly. Matthew's shoulders straightened. I stepped inside without raising my voice. "Good afternoon." Vanessa recovered first. "Eleanor, we didn't expect you." "That seems to be a pattern," I replied gently. Gordon cleared his throat. "We were just discussing some misunderstandings." "I'm sure you were," I said. I set my handbag down carefully on the console table. The air was tense, but I did not mirror it. Calm is destabilizing to those expecting emotion. "There appears to be confusion regarding ownership assumptions," I continued. Vanessa crossed her arms lightly. "We weren't assuming, we were planning ahead." "Planning ahead," I repeated softly, "without authority." Gordon stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, Vanessa believed there was a future understanding." "Based on what documentation?" I asked. Silence. Lucille's gaze shifted toward her daughter. Vanessa inhaled slowly. "You've always said this place would stay in the family." "It will," I said. "Under terms?" "What terms?" Matthew asked quietly. That was the first time he had spoken. I turned toward him. "Terms of respect." He frowned slightly. "Mom, what does that mean?" I held his gaze gently. "It means inheritance is not a right, it is a responsibility." Vanessa shifted again. "This is dramatic." "No," I replied calmly. "This is structural." Samuel had prepared printed copies of the relevant trust clause for me. I placed them on the counter. Gordon picked one up first. Lucille leaned in. Matthew read silently. Vanessa did not touch it at first. "This says," Gordon began slowly, "that any attempt to assert premature control may disqualify future distribution." "Correct," I said. Vanessa's composure cracked just slightly. "You can't be serious." "I am always serious when it comes to legal documentation." "You're punishing us for asking questions?" "You did not ask," I said evenly. "You acted." Matthew looked up from the page, eyes unsettled. "Mom, does this mean I could lose the condo entirely?" There it was, the question beneath all of it. "It means," I said carefully, "that if behavior indicates entitlement over respect, distribution changes." Vanessa laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "So this is control?" "No," I replied, "this is consequence." Gordon's face had gone pale. Vanessa, he said quietly, did you contact a bank? Vanessa hesitated. I was exploring options. Against a property you do not own? Lucille asked softly. That question carried more weight than anger ever could. Vanessa's jaw tightened. We're married, it's future marital property. Not yet, I said calmly. And not automatically. Matthew looked between us, something finally aligning behind his eyes. Vanessa, why didn't you tell me about the bank inquiry? Silence. A long one. She looked at him. Because I knew you'd hesitate? That answer was more revealing than she realized. Hesitate over what? He asked. Over securing our future, she replied. You're too cautious. I watched my son absorb that. Too cautious, too hesitant. Words she had likely used before in softer contexts. Encouraging him, pushing him, framing prudence as weakness. Prudence is not hesitation, I said gently. It is evaluation. Vanessa turned toward me. You've always underestimated me. No, I replied quietly. I observed you. That changed the air entirely. Gordon folded the paper slowly. This changes the situation. It clarifies it, I corrected. Lucille looked at her daughter, disappointment more visible now. Vanessa, did you tell us there was signed intent? Vanessa did not answer directly. I told you it was expected. Expected by whom? Gordon asked sharply. That question echoed the one I had asked days ago. Vanessa's composure thinned further. This is being blown out of proportion. It was proportionate the moment contractors were scheduled, I replied. Matthew set the papers down slowly. Mom, if the clause is triggered, what happens? It enters review, I said, and I determine amendment. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. You would cut your own son out? There it was, the accusation designed to redirect guilt. I would protect structure, I answered calmly. And if my son learns from this, structure remains intact. Matthew looked at me, not angry, not defensive. Processing. That is when I knew something had shifted. Doubt had matured into awareness. Vanessa stepped closer to him. You're going to let her threaten our future? She isn't threatening, Matthew said quietly. She's enforcing. Vanessa looked stunned, not because he was yelling, but because he was steady. Steadiness is far more unsettling than anger. This is ridiculous, she said finally. It's just paperwork. Paperwork, I said gently, is what protects reality. Lucille stood slowly. Vanessa, she said softly, did you represent ownership to us? Silence again. Vanessa looked cornered for the first time. I implied inevitability, she muttered. Gordon closed his eyes briefly. That single admission altered everything. I did not press further, I did not raise my voice. I simply gathered my bag again. I will not amend anything today, I said calmly, but this review process has begun. Vanessa stared at me. You're enjoying this? I shook my head slowly. No, I am correcting it. Matthew stepped toward me as I moved toward the door. Mom, can we talk later alone? Yes, I said gently. I left without another word. In the elevator, my reflection looked unchanged. But internally, something had settled. She believed acting like an owner would create ownership. Instead, she had activated the one mechanism she never considered: accountability. That evening, Samuel called. How did the meeting go? Predictable, I replied. Matthew is beginning to see. Good, he said. And Vanessa? I thought about her expression, the calculation, the disbelief, the fracture. She underestimated the clause, I said quietly. Most people underestimate clauses, Samuel replied dryly. That's why they exist. I sat by the ocean that night alone on the balcony. The waves moved as they always had. Unimpressed by human ambition, and I realized something important. This was never about renovation, it was about replacement. Vanessa did not want to modernize the condo. She wanted to modernize the hierarchy. Shift it. Reposition herself at the top. But she forgot something critical. Women who build their own foundations do not disappear politely. And what Vanessa still didn't know was that tomorrow, Matthew would ask a question she would not be prepared to answer. And that question would matter more than any clause I had drafted. The question he finally asked the next morning. Matthew arrived at my condo alone. That in itself was new. For 3 years, conversations had been triangulated, filtered, softened, reframed. But that morning, he stood at my door without Vanessa beside him, without her tone guiding his phrasing. I opened the door before he knocked twice. Come in, I said gently. He looked tired, not defeated, just unsettled. We sat at the small dining table near the balcony. The ocean was quiet again, but the air between us was not. "Mom," he began, rubbing his hands together, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." He hesitated for several seconds. And in those seconds, I saw the boy he used to be, trying to phrase things carefully so no one would feel hurt. "Did you create that trust because of Vanessa?" I did not answer immediately. I respected the question too much to rush it. "I created the trust because of patterns," I said calmly. "Patterns? Assumptions becoming language, language becoming plans, plans becoming actions." He exhaled slowly. "You thought she was positioning?" "Yes, and you didn't tell me." "Because at that time," I said softly, "I wasn't certain whether the pattern would mature into action." He looked at me directly then. "And now," I replied, "it has." He leaned back in his chair and stared out at the water. "She told me something last night." "What did she tell you?" "She said you never liked her. That you've been waiting for a reason to push her out." I almost smiled at that. It was predictable. "Matthew," I said gently, "if I disliked her, would I have allowed this to reach 3 years?" He didn't answer. "Dislike is loud," I continued. "Observation is quiet." That landed. He nodded slightly. "She says the bank inquiry was hypothetical. Was it discussed with you?" "No." "Then it was not hypothetical," I said. "It was exploratory?" He was silent again. Then he asked the question Samuel predicted. The question Vanessa was not prepared to answer. "Mom, what exactly did she trigger?" There it was, clarity seeking detail. I stood, walked to the drawer near the kitchen, and retrieved a copy of the clause. I handed it to him again. "Read the third paragraph carefully." He did, slower this time. "Any attempt by a beneficiary or affiliated party to assert financial leverage, structural modification, or represent ownership prior to formal transfer shall result in immediate review of distribution eligibility." He swallowed. "Affiliated party includes spouse." "Yes." He stared at the paper for a long time. "So because she contacted a bank and scheduled vendors, because she acted as though ownership was implied," I said gently. "Yes." He looked at me again, this time with something different in his eyes. Not accusation, not confusion, realization. "She told her parents the condo was practically ours." "I know," I replied, his head lifted sharply. "You knew." Lucille called. He closed his eyes briefly. "God," I didn't rush to fill the silence. Silence allows truth to settle. "Mom," he said finally, "did she lie to them?" "She implied inevitability." "That's not what I asked." His voice was steadier now. "Did she tell them you had agreed?" I held his gaze. "Yes." He looked away quickly, jaw tightening. That hurt him more than the clause ever could. "Why would she do that?" he whispered. "Because narrative builds confidence," I said softly. "If you repeat a future long enough, people stop questioning its origin." He nodded slowly. "She's done that before." That admission was quiet but significant. "In what way?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Small things. Saying my boss supported an idea before he did. Telling friends we were considering buying property before we'd even discussed it. It always felt premature." Premature, that word hung heavy. "And how did you respond?" I asked. "Usually I just went along with it. It didn't seem worth correcting." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Correction delayed becomes conflict amplified." He exhaled sharply. "You think she was trying to secure leverage?" "I think she believes security comes from possession," I said calmly. He was quiet again. Then, almost to himself, he said, "She told me you were becoming fragile." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "Fragile?" "She said you were overwhelmed managing everything alone, that you'd probably feel relieved handing over responsibility." I smiled faintly. "Did I appear overwhelmed?" "No." "Did I express desire to relinquish management?" "No." "Then why did she say that?" I asked gently. He didn't answer immediately, but I could see the connection forming. Reframing independence as weakness is one of the oldest strategies in quiet displacement. "She said it was about helping you," he added. "Help that isn't requested is rarely help," I replied. He sat back slowly. "Mom, if this review goes forward, what happens to me?" There it was, the core fear. "That depends," I said calmly. "On what?" "On whether you allow assumption to replace integrity." He studied my face carefully. "You would change the trust." It wasn't a question. "If patterns continue," I replied softly, "yes." He nodded once, not in anger. In understanding, we sat in silence for a while after that. The ocean moved in the background like it always had, unconcerned with human conflict. Finally, he spoke again. She's furious. At whom? I asked. At you, at me. At her parents. Because exposure feels like betrayal, I said gently, especially when you believed the narrative was solid. He rubbed his temples. She said you humiliated her in front of them. Did I speak harshly? No. Then humiliation came from discrepancy, I replied. He gave a small, tired laugh. You always sound like you're explaining a ledger. Life is often arithmetic, I said softly. Actions equal consequences. He stood then and walked toward the balcony. I joined him. We stood side by side looking out at the water. I need to ask her something, he said quietly. Ask it clearly, I replied, and listen carefully to the answer. He nodded slowly. If she says she was just planning ahead, then ask why planning required misrepresentation. He exhaled. And if she says she was securing our future, ask whose consent she required. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to me. Mom, I think I've been avoiding this for a while. Avoidance preserves comfort, I said gently, but erodes clarity. He nodded again. I'm going to speak with her tonight. Good. He hesitated, then added softly, I don't want to lose her. I looked at him carefully. Then she must decide whether she values structure more than strategy. He absorbed that without arguing. After he left, I called Samuel. He's beginning to see, I said. Good, Samuel replied. And Vanessa, I thought about her composure cracking just slightly yesterday. She will escalate before she retreats. Likely, he agreed. Prepare for emotional leverage. I knew what that meant. Because when structural control fails, emotional pressure often follows. That evening, just after sunset, my phone buzzed. It was Matthew. I answered immediately. His voice was steady. Mom, she admitted it. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. Admitted what? That she told her parents you'd agreed to transfer. She said it was easier than explaining we hadn't discussed it. I closed my eyes briefly. And the bank, she said she was protecting momentum. Protecting momentum. I almost admired the phrasing. Did she apologize? I asked. Silence. She said you forced her into a defensive position. There it was, no remorse. Only repositioning. And how do you feel? I asked softly. He took several seconds before answering. I feel like I've been living inside a version of the future that was drafted without me. That sentence told me everything. He was waking up. Mom, he continued, voice lower now, there's something else. My chest tightened slightly. What is it? She said if this trust review goes forward, she doesn't know if she can stay in this marriage. The threat was quiet, but unmistakable, and there it was, emotional leverage. Samuel had predicted it perfectly. I stared out at the darkened ocean for a long moment before answering. Then the question is not about the trust, I said calmly. It is about conditional loyalty. He didn't respond immediately. Mom, he said finally, I don't know what I'm about to find out. Neither do I replied softly. But truth is always less dangerous than illusion. There was a long pause on the line. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. Yes, I answered. After we hung up, I stood alone on the balcony once more. The wind had shifted slightly, stronger now. And I understood something with absolute clarity. Vanessa believed ownership could be rehearsed into reality. She believed narrative could outrun documentation, but she had just escalated from structural leverage to emotional ultimatum. And ultimatums rarely strengthen a foundation. They expose fractures. What she did not yet understand was that Matthew's next decision would not be about the condo at all. It would be about trust. And once trust cracks, no renovation can fix it. The ultimatum the morning after Matthew told me about Vanessa's conditional threat, the ocean looked different. Not violent, just heavier, as if something beneath the surface had shifted direction. I was already awake when my phone vibrated at 6:42 a.m. It was Matthew. That alone told me the conversation the night before had not ended quietly. Mom, he said without greeting. She packed a bag. I sat upright in bed. Explain. After I told her I needed time to think, she said she wouldn't stay in a marriage where she wasn't secured. Those were her words. Secured, there it was again, security as possession. And then, I asked. She said if I allowed the trust review to continue, she'd interpret it as me choosing you over our future. I closed my eyes briefly. The framing was precise. Make it a competition, force alignment. What did you say? I told her this wasn't about choosing you, it was about choosing integrity. My breath slowed. That was not a sentence I coached, that was his. And she asked me if I loved her. Of course she did. When logic fails, pivot to emotion. What did you answer? I asked gently. I said yes, but love doesn't eliminate accountability. There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then he added quietly, she didn't like that. I almost smiled. Accountability is rarely welcomed by those who rely on momentum. Where is she now? I asked. At her parents' place. That did not surprise me. Gordon and Lucille would not endorse her behavior publicly, but they would not abandon her either. Mom, Matthew continued, voice lower now, I need to ask you something difficult. Go ahead. If she apologizes, if she says she panicked, if she agrees to drop the bank inquiries and vendor contacts, would you reconsider the clause? There it was. The negotiation phase, not from entitlement but from hope. I did not answer immediately, because this question required more than policy, it required principle. An apology, I said carefully, does not erase documentation. He inhaled slowly. So there's no path back? There is always a path, I replied, but it must be built on transparency, not pressure. Silence. Then he asked, would you meet with her? I stared out at the water for a long moment. Yes, I said finally. On one condition. What? You are present and she speaks without reframing. He agreed quickly. I'll arrange it. We met that afternoon in the condo. I insisted on that location deliberately. Territory matters in conversations about displacement. Vanessa arrived 15 minutes late, not dramatically, just enough to signal control. She looked composed, pale blue dress, hair smooth, expression measured. Gordon and Lucille did not attend. This was no longer a parental optics issue. This was structural. We sat at the dining table again, the same place Matthew and I had spoken yesterday. Vanessa folded her hands neatly. Eleanor, she began, voice calm, I think this has gone too far. I did not respond immediately. Silence is clarifying. I never intended to trigger legal consequences, she continued. Intent, I said softly, is often irrelevant to outcome. She held my gaze. I was planning, not stealing. Planning without authority is preemptive control, I replied. She exhaled quietly. I panicked. That word was new. Panic implies fear. What were you afraid of? I asked. She hesitated, just slightly. Uncertainty. I watched her carefully. Uncertainty of what? Of building a future without stability. There it was again, stability defined externally. And stability meant this condo? I asked. It meant security, she replied. Matthew shifted in his chair. Vanessa, he said gently, security doesn't require misrepresentation. She turned toward him. I didn't misrepresent. I anticipated. I leaned forward slightly. You told your parents I had agreed. She did not deny it this time. It felt implied. Implied by silence, I asked softly. Her composure thinned. You never said no. That sentence hung in the air like a confession. Matthew inhaled sharply. You're saying because she didn't object it was consent? Vanessa looked at him, frustration creeping in. That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? He pressed. She hesitated longer now, and that hesitation revealed more than words ever could. I thought, she said finally, that eventually you'd transfer it anyway. Eventually, I repeated. Is not a contract? The room went still. Vanessa looked between us. For the first time since this began, she seemed smaller, not defeated, just exposed. I don't want to lose my marriage over paperwork, she said quietly. Matthew spoke before I could. This isn't paperwork. His voice was steady. It's trust. That landed heavier than anything I had said in 6 chapters. She turned to him slowly. So you're choosing this over us? I'm choosing clarity, he replied. Vanessa looked back at me. If I apologize, she said carefully, will you withdraw the review? There it was, the negotiation made explicit. I studied her face for several seconds. An apology must acknowledge specific action, I said calmly, not abstract discomfort. She swallowed. Fine, I should not have contacted the bank. And, I prompted gently, I should not have scheduled contractors. And, Matthew added quietly, she hesitated again, longer this time. I should not have told my parents you'd agreed. The room was silent. I watched her closely. There were no tears, no trembling. Just calculation giving way to containment. Why did you do it? Matthew asked softly. She looked at him. Because I thought if it felt inevitable to everyone else, it would become inevitable to you. That honesty, unintended as it may have been, changed everything. Matthew leaned back slowly. He did not look angry, he looked resolved. That's manipulation, he said quietly. Vanessa's jaw tightened. It's strategy? It's manipulation, he repeated. I did not intervene. This was his moment. Vanessa, he continued, voice steady, you asked if I loved you, I do, but I won't build a life on leverage. She looked at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. So what happens now? She asked quietly. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Now, I said, we decide whether this marriage is partnership or positioning. Silence. The ocean moved behind us like a quiet witness. If I agree to transparency, she said slowly, will the clause remain dormant? The review continues, I replied evenly, but outcome depends on behavior. She looked down at the table. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed uncertain not about strategy but about control. And if I refuse, she asked quietly. Matthew answered before I could. Then I refuse with you. That sentence sealed the room. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly, not in anger, in recognition. He was no longer standing in the middle, he had stepped somewhere. She stood slowly from the table. I need time, she said. Take it, I replied gently. She walked toward the door without drama, no slammed exits. No tears, just quiet retreat. When the door closed, Matthew remained seated. He looked at the balcony, then at me. I should have asked that question years ago, he said softly. Which one? I asked. Whether she was building with me or around me. I nodded gently. Better late than never. He exhaled slowly. Mom, I don't know how this ends. I looked out at the water again. It ends, I said quietly, with whatever structure survives pressure. He nodded. After he left, I called Samuel. Progress? He asked. Exposure, I replied. He was silent for a moment. And Vanessa, considering her next move. Samuel's tone lowered slightly. Prepare for escalation. When leverage fails quietly, it often returns emotionally. I knew he was right because Vanessa does not surrender, she recalibrates. And that evening, as I stood alone on the balcony watching the sun drop into the horizon, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. I opened it slowly. It was a screenshot. A social media post. Vanessa's account. Caption. Sometimes the hardest thing is realizing you were never truly welcomed. My breath did not change, but my clarity sharpened. She had shifted from structural to narrative warfare, and narrative spreads faster than paperwork. What she did not yet understand was that documentation travels further than perception. And tomorrow, that distinction would matter more than any apology. When narrative met evidence, the screenshot Vanessa posted traveled faster than I expected. By morning, 2 distant relatives had messaged me with carefully worded concern. One former colleague sent a neutral hope everything is all right. Narrative works like that. It never states facts directly. It suggests atmosphere. Sometimes the hardest thing is realizing you were never truly welcomed. It positioned her as excluded. Marginalized, softly rejected. It was clever. I did not respond publicly. Silence online is more powerful than defense. Instead, I forwarded the screenshot to Samuel. He called within minutes. She's escalating perception, he said calmly. Expected. Do we respond? I asked. Not yet, he replied. Let her build narrative, we'll address facts. That distinction mattered. Narrative is emotional currency. Facts are structural. And structure outlasts performance. Matthew arrived that afternoon without calling first. His face told me the post had reached him through more channels than mine. My coworkers saw it, he said quietly after stepping inside. 2 people asked if you'd cut Vanessa out. And what did you say? I asked. I said the situation was private. He looked at me then. She knew exactly what she was doing. Yes, I said gently. She did. He paced slightly across the living room. Mom, she called me this morning, said she feels humiliated, said you turned her into a villain. Did I? I asked calmly. He stopped pacing. No, then humiliation came from discrepancy, I replied softly. He exhaled. She says the clause makes her look like a gold digger. I tilted my head slightly. Does documentation create appearance or reveal intention? He didn't answer immediately, then he shook his head slowly. She keeps saying you never welcomed her fully. Did I exclude her? I asked. No. Did I insult her? No. Did I set boundaries? Yes, there it was. Boundaries are often rebranded as rejection by those who benefit from access. Matthew sat down heavily on the sofa. She's telling people you're isolating me. Are you isolated? I asked gently. He looked around the room, the open balcony, the ocean, the quiet. No. Isolation removes choice, I continued. You are here by choice. He nodded slowly. Her parents called me too, he added. That caught my attention. And Gordon asked if I was sure I understood the legal implications. Lucille sounded tired. That word mattered. Tired of what? I asked. Of managing fallout, he said quietly. That evening, Gordon himself requested a meeting, not at the condo, not at his home, at a private club he frequented downtown. The location choice was deliberate. Neutral but prestigious, I agreed. Matthew insisted on attending. When we arrived, Gordon and Lucille were already seated in a corner room. Gordon stood as we approached. Lucille offered a restrained nod. Mrs. Whitmore, Gordon began, this has spiraled. It clarified, I replied evenly. He cleared his throat. Vanessa is distressed. Distress follows exposure, I said calmly. Lucille leaned forward slightly. She believes you intended to trap her. I did not smile, but I allowed a small pause before responding. The clause existed before her actions. Gordon's jaw tightened slightly. Vanessa says the trust feels punitive. Trust is not punitive, I replied. It is protective. Matthew spoke then, voice measured. Vanessa admitted she implied ownership. Gordon closed his eyes briefly. Lucille looked down at the table. She says she was securing stability, Lucille murmured. By misrepresentation? I asked gently. Silence answered me. Gordon shifted in his chair. She feels cornered. Cornered people escalate, I replied, which is why this meeting matters. Gordon looked at me directly. What do you want? That question was important, because it assumed desire for leverage. I want structure intact, I said calmly, and honesty restored. Lucille studied my face. And if Vanessa refuses, I looked at Matthew before answering, then the review proceeds. Gordon inhaled slowly. Do you understand what that means for their marriage? Yes, I said quietly. Do you? The room stilled. Gordon leaned back slightly. You're willing to let this fracture. I am unwilling to let it rot, I replied. That landed differently. Lucille's eyes softened for the first time. You don't sound angry, she said quietly. I'm not, I answered. Anger clouds arithmetic. Matthew looked at me then with something like quiet pride. Gordon cleared his throat again. Vanessa says she's considering formal separation. Matthew did not flinch this time. That would be her decision, he said evenly. That sentence shifted the dynamic entirely. Gordon looked surprised. Lucille studied her son-in-law carefully. You aren't fighting for her? She asked. Matthew's voice remained steady. I am fighting for clarity. There it was again, his own language now, not mine, not hers, his. The meeting ended without resolution, but something had shifted. Not in Vanessa, in Matthew. That night Vanessa escalated again. Another post, this time more direct. It's painful when financial control masquerades as morality. That one was sharper. The comments multiplied quickly. Sympathy. Speculation, subtle criticism. I forwarded it to Samuel again. His response came within minutes. Time, he wrote. It's time. The next morning, Samuel sent a formal letter to Vanessa's counsel. Yes, counsel. Because apparently she had retained one overnight. The letter was precise, not emotional. It outlined the trust's original creation date, the clause language, the documented bank inquiry, the vendor scheduling attempt, the implied ownership representation. It did not accuse, it presented chronology. By noon, Vanessa's posts disappeared, all of them. Matthew called me at 2:17 p.m. She deleted everything. Yes, I said calmly. Her attorney advised against narrative conflict. You knew she'd hire one, he said. Of course. He was quiet for a moment. She's furious. Of exposure, I asked. Of losing leverage, he replied. That was growth. He was naming it correctly now. Mom, he continued more softly, I think she thought you'd fold under social pressure. I do not respond to pressure, I said gently. I respond to structure. He exhaled slowly. She asked me one more question. What was it? She asked if I believed she loved me. I waited. I told her love without respect is attachment. Silence filled the line. Then he added, almost to himself, I don't think she understood that. That evening, Vanessa came to the condo without announcing herself, not to enter. The new locks prevented that. She stood outside the building entrance. Matthew went down alone to speak with her. I watched from the balcony above, unseen. They stood several feet apart. No yelling, no dramatics, just two people at a crossroads. I could not hear their words, but I could see body language. She leaned forward repeatedly. He remained upright, steady. After several minutes, she stepped back. Her shoulders dropped slightly, then she turned and walked away without looking back. Matthew remained standing there for nearly a full minute before returning upstairs. When he entered, he did not speak immediately. He walked to the balcony and stood beside me. She asked if I'd withdraw support of the review, he said quietly. And I said no. I nodded once. He looked at the horizon. She said if this goes forward, she won't come back. The wind moved gently between us. And what did you say? I asked. He took a slow breath. I said if integrity makes her leave, then she was already gone. That was the moment I knew the outcome was no longer uncertain, not because the marriage was ending, but because clarity had arrived. He wasn't speaking from fear anymore, he was speaking from alignment. Mom, he added softly, I think I was afraid of being alone. Fear of solitude, I said gently, keeps many people in misalignment. He nodded. But being alone is not the same as being unsupported. I placed my hand over his briefly. No, it isn't. Later that night, Samuel called again. Vanessa's attorney has requested mediation, he said. Regarding what? I asked. The trust clause, they want to argue it constitutes undue emotional pressure. I almost smiled. On what grounds? On the grounds that you knew she feared financial instability. Fear does not nullify documentation, I replied. Exactly, he paused slightly. This will likely move to formal review. I looked out at the dark water. Then we proceed. Because here is what Vanessa still did not understand. This was never about punishing ambition. It was about protecting foundation. She believed narrative would soften structure, but structure does not bend for perception. And tomorrow, when mediation begins, the one thing she will finally confront is that arithmetic has no emotions. Only outcomes. What remains when leverage fails? Mediation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Neutral office. Long polished table. Filtered light through tall windows. It felt less like a battlefield and more like a boardroom, which in many ways it was. Because this was never about emotion, it was about structure. Samuel sat beside me, documents arranged with quiet precision. Across the table sat Vanessa and her attorney. She looked composed as always. Cream blazer. Minimal jewelry, expression calibrated. Matthew sat slightly behind us, not aligned with either side, but no longer suspended between them. The mediator began with predictable language. We are here to resolve conflict constructively. Samuel nodded politely. Vanessa's attorney spoke first. Our position is that the trust clause creates undue relational pressure. Mrs. Whitmore's actions have destabilized a marriage. I did not interrupt. Pressure, I have learned, reveals itself through wording. Samuel responded calmly. The trust was established 12 years ago. The clause predates the marriage. It protects against premature assertion. Vanessa's attorney leaned forward. Intent matters. Chronology matters more, Samuel replied evenly. Documents were passed across the table. Dates, inquiry records, vendor emails. Vanessa's initial post timestamps. The mediator reviewed them carefully. Vanessa remained silent, watching, calculating. Finally, she spoke. I never tried to steal anything. Her voice was steady. I was planning ahead. I met her gaze directly. Planning ahead requires consent from present ownership. Silence followed, not tense, just final. Her attorney shifted strategies. Would Mrs. Whitmore consider amending the clause to remove spousal implication? There it was, the real objective, neutralize the mechanism. I folded my hands on the table. No, Vanessa inhaled slowly, not surprised. Just acknowledging inevitability. Then what do you want? She asked quietly. It was not accusatory this time, it was tired. I want alignment, I replied calmly. Not leverage. Matthew shifted slightly in his seat, but he did not speak. Vanessa studied him instead of me. And if I agree to full transparency, she asked. I did not answer immediately because this was the final arithmetic. Transparency after exposure, I said gently, is repair, not prevention. She looked down briefly, then back up. So there is no version of this where you trust me? That question mattered, not legally, personally. Trust, I replied softly, is not rebuilt through negotiation. The mediator glanced between us. Then perhaps we should clarify end states. Vanessa's attorney spoke quietly with her. After a few seconds, she nodded once. Then she looked at Matthew. If the clause stands, she said carefully, I cannot remain in this marriage. There it was, the final ultimatum, not shouted, not emotional, just stated. Matthew did not react immediately. He looked at her with something I had not seen before. Not anger, not hurt, recognition. Then you're choosing leverage over us, he said quietly. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Because for the first time the framing no longer worked, he had stepped outside of it. No, she said finally, I'm choosing stability. Stability built on pressure isn't stable, he replied. The mediator cleared his throat softly. It appears reconciliation under current conditions is unlikely. Samuel closed his folder. Then the review proceeds. Vanessa did not cry, she did not argue, she simply nodded once. Then I'll file for separation. Matthew inhaled slowly, then nodded once in return. Okay, that was it, no theatrics, no collapse, just arithmetic concluding. When we left the building, the sky was overcast. The air heavier than usual. Matthew walked beside me in silence until we reached the parking lot. Mom, he said finally, I thought I'd feel more devastated. I looked at him carefully. And what do you feel? Clear. That word mattered more than grief. Clarity often feels like loss at first, I said gently, because illusion dissolves. He nodded slowly. She asked me one last thing, he added. What was it? She asked if I'd resent you. I stopped walking. And he met my eyes. I told her no because you didn't break my marriage, you exposed its weakness. The wind shifted slightly around us. I did not hug him. I did not dramatize the moment. I simply nodded once. Good. The formal separation filing came 2 weeks later. Vanessa's social media remained silent. No narratives, no subtle posts. Her parents reached out quietly to me once. Lucille's voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. We're disappointed, she said, but we understand. Gordon did not speak long. Structure matters, he said simply. It did. Samuel finalized the trust review 1 month later. The clause remained intact. Matthew's distribution pathway remained conditional upon no further assertion behavior from affiliated parties. He signed acknowledgement without hesitation. I don't want anything I didn't earn, he said quietly. That sentence settled something inside me more than any legal document ever could. Weeks passed. The condo felt different. Not quieter, it had always been quiet, but lighter. Matthew began visiting on Sundays again, not out of obligation, out of choice. One evening, as we stood on the balcony watching the sun lower into the horizon, he spoke softly. You know what I realized? What? I asked. Vanessa didn't want the condo. I turned slightly toward him. What did she want? Position. He looked out at the water. Ownership symbolized control. It wasn't about real estate. It was about hierarchy. I nodded slowly. And what do you want? I asked. He thought for a moment. Peace. That answer told me the story had ended correctly, not dramatically, not vindictively, correctly. Because peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries. Several months later, a letter arrived, handwritten from Vanessa, short, direct. I underestimated you, I mistook composure for weakness. I thought momentum could replace consent, I was wrong. There was no apology, but there was recognition, that was enough. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, as a reminder. Of something every woman eventually learns, sometimes later than she should. Being calm does not mean being passive. Being kind does not mean being compliant. And protecting what you built is not selfish. It is structural. The ocean continues its rhythm outside this balcony every evening. The walls remain unpainted in anyone else's preferred shade. The locks remain mine. The title remains mine, and Matthew remains my son not because I controlled him, but because I refused to surrender clarity. What Vanessa believed was that ownership could be rehearsed into existence. What she learned was that foundations built over decades do not yield to assumption. And what my son learned, perhaps the most important lesson of all, is that love without respect becomes leverage. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I am 67 years old. I built this condo dollar by dollar. And the quietest move I ever made was deciding that no one would inherit what they had not yet learned how to honor.